Why, hello, everyone. We've got 12 people so far. I admit that's more than I was expecting. It's good to see y'all again. And it's been a while since we've last talked. I want to draw your attention to the live chat on the right side of the screen. If you have any questions as we're kind of going along, or you need to stop me, or if I'm being unclear, please say something. I've never done YouTube Live before, so we're going to be trying some new stuff here. Apparently, there's a way to do screen sharing, but I don't quite have a handle on that yet. So we might see that on the next video. Okay, so I guess before we get started on the Karl Marx stuff, how is everyone doing? So, Kat, you are at work, and what about other people? How are y'all doing? Is everyone okay? Everyone's managed to not get sick, hopefully, or if you are sick, hopefully you got medicine and you're practicing your social distancing. I'm doing well. Oh, stressed? Yeah, that's fair. This is a stressful time. Yep, tired. I could definitely see that. This is really throwing off my sleep. Like the first couple of days, I felt like I slept really well, and then ever since then, it's just been kind of a mess. Yeah, stressed. That definitely probably the most overwhelming emotion that people are feeling right now. Okay, well, did everyone have fun with the nation state stuff? I think it's an interesting project, getting to run your own little country. So hopefully everyone managed to figure that out and turn in a screenshot. No, do not stay up so late. That is how you bottom out your immune system. I don't know. I'm not that kind of medical doctor, but it seems like when you're not sleeping enough, that's when you're more likely to get sick. And since that's kind of the problem right now, no. Okay. Yeah. No, this isn't coffee. This is just water. I already had my coffee. I'll have another one after this, though. Missing an advisor meeting till 5. What are y'all doing? Okay. So normally when I see you in class, I get to harangue your bad habits. I guess we'll just do it over YouTube now. Please don't stay up till 5. That's just not good. Okay. So in terms of good habits, are any of y'all doing anything to get by that we could consider to be meaningfully healthy? Like, for example, I've started reading this book on Aristotle by a political philosopher named Alan Ryan, and I found it to be quite challenging and fun. So have y'all done anything like that? Eating? Mm-hmm. Okay, working out? Yep, good. I've been walking on the treadmill, right? Nature walks? Hopefully you're not running into people out there. I've been surprised how many people are walking around my neighborhood. I think that kind of gets rid of the social distancing thing that we're supposed to be doing. But what do I know? Again, not that kind of a doctor. So I'm hanging out with Biscuit. He's over there. Y'all see him? Biscuit, say hi. Yeah, he's so cute. Okay. So yeah, I think that's the basic gist of stuff that's going on with me. Yes, my dog is so cute. Yes, he's coming over here. Maybe he's going to investigate. You want to come here? You want to come say hi? All right, come say hi. Come here. No, come here. Come here. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, in case you haven't seen in the other videos, this is Biscuit Kiner, right? He's an EE cream dachshund. Yes, and he's so sweet. So yes, if you hear any random barking in the background, it is courtesy of this fella. If you don't know anything about dachshunds, they bark all the time. They're always on high alert, but they're very sweet and affectionate dogs, at least if you get a long-haired one. So yeah, there you go. Anyway, if you have any questions for Biscuit, I will relay them to him, and hopefully he'll answer. Okay. So I don't really have a perfect format for this. I read the Marx again yesterday. I kind of reviewed my notes and everything, and so I figure this would take 30 minutes to an hour, depending on if y'all want to talk or if you have a lot of questions or whatever. And the other thing being, how am I going to kind of relay information to you? So going forward, I'm going to try to figure out a screen share thing. But for now, it's just going to be me talking and kind of reading to you. So hopefully that's going to be sufficient. Well, I guess let me see. I imagine you cannot see this, can you? No, you can't. What are these little... I have no idea. Okay. So, all right, so you can't see anything that I'm seeing. That's a little disappointing. But such is life. Okay. So let me start with the Marx stuff. So Karl Marx, he's really an interesting guy. He was born in 1818 and he dies in 1883. He was actually, even though we think of him as being a communist, and so a lot of times we're tempted to think of him as being Russian, kind of because we associate Russia with communism, he was actually German. And he was a philosopher, an economist, a historian, a political theorist, a sociologist, and a journalist. And his kind of one of his most famous quotes is that the philosophers have sought to understand the world, but the point of philosophy is to change it. So Marx adopts this attitude of understanding for the sake of changing the social order, and that's really important to understand about him. Okay, so he wrote a bunch of different things, books, articles, and there's even some interesting stuff about whether he wrote certain things or if his collaborator Friedrich Engels wrote them. So those are some interesting studies. But sorry, Biscuit wants to play ball. No, Daddy's working. Okay. All right. So his most famous works are probably Capital and the Communist Manifesto. And of course, we're going to talk about the Communist Manifesto. Stop, Biscuit. Stop. Now, Marx grew up as the son of a lawyer in a middle-class family, which means, he grew up reasonably well off. He was able to go to school. He was able to get university educated, and he was going to practice law. But eventually, when he got to the point where he was having to make a decision, he took up with a group of young thinkers called the Young Hegelians. And this is a radical group of young scholars who worked in the tradition of Hegel, who was a German philosopher. And Hegel used this whole idea that he called the dialectic. And here's how the dialectic works. It says every problem, right, or everything comes into existence, and that presents a thesis, okay? But the second you have a thesis, right, the second that it comes into existence, you develop an antithesis or an antithesis, depending on who's teaching you, okay? And this is kind of the problem with whatever the thesis is. And so then the tension between the thesis and the antithesis or the antithesis is resolved through a process called synthesis. And once you go through synthesis, you get a new thesis. And then when you get a new thesis, you get a new antithesis, and then you resolve that via synthesis. Okay. So Marx says that this is how society moves through successive stages. And so he thinks that society kind of progressively follows a certain model, from primitive communism to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism, and then from socialism to communism. So yeah, that's the basics of the Marxian stages. But what's important to understand is that he's using this dialectic that he picks up from Hegel. And Marx considers himself, and he describes himself as a historical materialist. So he's not interested in ideas and what people think about stuff. What he's interested in is the material conditions of people's lives. Like, how much food do they have on the table? What is the state of their living conditions? How long do they live? So he's not really interested in either the realm of like spiritual things or the realm of values, but pretty much only in these material conditions. Sorry, Biscuit keeps wanting to play ball. Okay. Anyway, so yes, this focus on material things, and in fact, this is something that we want to think of perhaps as something that mature Marx develops. Stop, Biscuit. No. Okay. No. But it was actually present with Marx from an early age. In fact, his dad writes this really kind of poignant letter to him when he's away at school, saying that he has his heart is ruled by a demon. That Karl's heart is ruled by a demon, and he's not sure if this is like a good demon or if this is a bad demon, because he doesn't see anything for the tender parts of life in his son. No respect, no love for those things. And since he doesn't have any respect or love for those things, any no tenderness, I think is the phrase he uses, no tenderness for the tender parts of life, as it were, that he's quite worried about his son. Okay, so you can imagine if your dad said something to that effect about you, that might be a little bit worrisome, and that gets Biscuit, stop, taken up with his academic work as he goes on with his life. Okay, so that's the historical materialism stuff. Now, Marx kind of carves out his niche in social theory with this idea of class struggle. So he says that in any society, the primary relationship is between the oppressive class and the oppressed class, or the oppressor and the oppressed. And he says that this is a relationship that is sometimes out in the open, sometimes hidden, and over the course of history, sometimes it's easy to see, and other times it's hidden. And part of that has to do with the modes of production, and part of that has to do with the relations of production. So mode of production is, as the name implies, how people produce the goods and services that they need to get by, and the relations of production are kind of who is doing the making and who's doing the buying. No, sir. Okay, hold on. I have to put Biscuit away. Okay, come on. Come here. You gotta go over here. Daddy's working. Okay? Come on. Okay. All right. There we go. We will see. Yes, doggo indeed, Daniel. Doggo indeed. Okay. So, where was I? Oh, yeah, class struggle. So, can you hear him crying in the background? I put him in the room. Okay. Hopefully you can't. It's so pathetic. All right. So the class struggle. In any given society, you have the class struggle. For Marx, this is an ever-present thing that's only going to disappear when you reach when communism is fully realized. So he's observing this transformation from bourgeois society in the feudal period, and how the bourgeoisie kind of are coming about and rising to power then, and they become the powerful class in capitalism. And then he thinks capitalism is planting the seeds of its own demise. I'll talk about that in a second. And when eventually the workers of the world realize their shared struggle, they will rise up and overthrow the capitalist class. And that's how we'll reach socialism as a mode of production. And then the defining feature of socialism will be the state. And eventually the state will no longer be needed to kind of manage the class struggle, and the state will disappear, and we will go into communism. And Marx sees this as inevitable. And he predicts that this is going to happen in the most industrialized economies first, because he says that's where the workers are most alienated from their labor, because they work in the factories where they all perform just a small part of the task, and no one's creating anything from scratch, for example. And so he thinks those workers are going to realize their shared struggle, and that they'll rise up and overthrow the capitalist class. Okay. So I don't know how many of you are students of history or interested in this kind of thing, but Marx turned out to be wrong. It was actually in the developed countries that we didn't have, or developed is maybe the wrong word, in the most highly economically developed, I guess that's what I mean by developed, that we didn't develop the overthrow of the capitalist class. In fact, it happened in other places, like Russia and like Cuba. So that's been a difficult thing for people working in the Marxist tradition to kind of explain. There have been, explanations, of course, about the use of credit and the increase in credit and the wider availability of credit, so that people had an opportunity to do things that they wouldn't have been able to afford to do before. But for the most part, that's a story for another day. We're focusing on Marx himself today. Okay, so right, I talked about the dialectic, and the important thing about the dialectic to remember is that you have these modes of production are each of the individual theses, and then the class struggle is the antithesis in each mode of production, and then eventually you have the revolution, and that is the synthesis that produces a new mode of production. And again, we move from primitive communism to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism, and from socialism to communism. And Marx says that every economy around the world, every civilization around the world is going to go through those stages, and that's the only way to get to communism. Okay. The last little thing about Marx's life that I want to talk about is he was in political exile for most of his life, and spent a lot of that time in England, where he actually worked and lived and was able to live because of the patronage of Friedrich Engels, who was a friend of his. And Engels' family had become fabulously wealthy in manufacturing, as it were, and him and Marx worked together as part of this socialist, communist kind of elite academic circle, but their writings were designed to be accessible to the working class people, because they wanted the workers of the world to unite. So if you read the Communist Manifesto, or Manifesto of Class Struggle, rather, section that I pointed out to you, you'll notice that the language, especially compared to the next couple things we're going to read, is not especially difficult. And what's interesting about that is that was on par for the reading level of the working class people. And so you can see that Marx is very much interested in being able to relate to his base, because if people couldn't understand what he was saying, how are they going to have their consciousness raised, as it were? Okay, so that's enough of the introductory stuff. Let me kind of jump into the Marx. Okay, so I'm pulling up the book here. The easiest way to find it is just to go to the library website, which is lib.utsa.edu, and search for Social Theory, the Multicultural and Classic Readings, and it will bring it up. It's a book by Charles Lemmert, and we have access to it online via a couple of different publishers. And so all you got to do is click on it, and then load the book to read it online. And then the easiest way to find these things is to just click on the table of contents and then find the particular reading that I'm talking about. So in this case, I think I'm looking at the 6th edition, and it's on page 30. It's page 34, but it's actually page 57. So if you type 34 into the little box, that's how you find it. Okay, but anyway, here we go. He says, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So again, this is the doctrine of historical materialism, explaining how the changes in the mode of production come about through this social dialectic, this struggle between oppressor and oppressed classes. Okay, so he's saying that the history, all of history, is really only about class struggle. Okay, and we can talk about whether or not that's a valid way of looking at the world. But that's Marx's position. Okay. He starts talking about all of the different different gradations in social rank that people had in different times in history. He talks about Rome and the Middle Ages and stuff like that. But he's making a point because he comes to this capitalist society and he says that basically what they've done is they've done away with all of the different gradations in social rank, and now there are only two social ranks, and you have the bourgeoisie and you have the proletariat. Now, the proletariat are the people who sell their labor power, and the bourgeoisie are the people who they own what he calls the means of production. So these are the people who own the equipment, they own the factories, they own the means by which people produce things. And the proletariat then are forced to sell their labor power, so they become wage laborers. And Marx thinks this is a terrible thing, and that this is how people lose their dignity. So that previously prestigious professions with a lot of dignity, like being a lawyer or being a physician, these people are now wage laborers. So you take someone like a college professor, and Marx would say, I'm part of the proletariat because I sell my labor power as an academic to UTSA so that I can teach you. But then also you'd have to talk about how, like, even the president of UTSA is proletariat by Marx's definition, because again, he sells his labor power so that he can be president of the school. I'm trying to think who would be the bourgeoisie at UTSA. Maybe the people who own the buildings, which we can't really say is the president because the president changes at UTSA. Yeah, it's complicated. It was maybe a simpler thing to understand in Marx's time, kind of on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, where you had people like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie who bought up so much of the equipment and the technology that was needed to produce and to mass produce things like oil and steel. And so these people were very clearly part of the bourgeoisie. And what happens is, as the different members of the bourgeoisie class compete with each other, some win and some lose. And the losers go out of business and they become, that's right, part of the proletariat. And this is why Marx thinks that the bourgeoisie sows the seeds of its own demise, because the bourgeoisie class can only get smaller because for him, wealth is a zero-sum thing, so that whoever has the money, right, that concentrates the capital, right, the amount of capital keeps getting concentrated, and so people continue to fall out of the bourgeoisie class and they end up in the proletariat. So the proletariat class continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I've said an awful lot of things in 23 minutes. Is everyone with me? Are there any questions? I'll sit here and wait for a second. Have some water. Okay, no questions so far. All right, we're doing good. All right, let's keep going. So, all right. So Marx says the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. So again, Marx is a materialist, and he's interested in these changes in the material conditions of life, right? Who has the money? What does that look like? What kinds of comforts do people have at home? What sorts of access to healthcare and to food do they have? And so he's talking about how with these new markets opening up, suddenly you have goods to bring back, and you also have places to ship your goods. So y'all know I'm a cultural sociologist. The area that I specialize in within cultural sociology is the sociology of food. And if you don't know, when Columbus came to the New World, one of the things that he was looking for was for pepper, because pepper was enormously expensive and hard to get. And but he didn't find pepper in the New World. He found chili peppers, and so he kind of took them back, and he basically tried to sell it that, well, they're kind of piquant, like pepper, and so that's why we call them chili peppers, which is ludicrous and humorous, that he was basically trying to pass it off that he found pepper, and it just wasn't the tiny black peppercorns that we're all familiar with. It was these large spicy peppers like jalapenos and things of that nature. But also you end up with access to things that we didn't have before in Europe. Vanilla for one, chocolate for another. Those are both New World products. Potatoes, tomatoes. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? I can't. But originally, Italian food didn't have tomatoes in it. And in fact, tomatoes are a New World crop that they took back to Europe and cultivated there. And it was hard to get people to eat them because people thought it bore an uncanny resemblance to nightshade, which was poisonous. And so they didn't want to eat that and get sick and die. And the same kind of thing happened with potatoes. Potatoes were easy to cultivate. They were easy to produce cheaply, and so they thought it would be a great staple food for peasants. But the peasants didn't want to eat it. They would rather die. And so even in incidences where they were starving, it was still really difficult to convince the peasants to eat the potatoes. And of course, eventually they did, which is how we come to the kind of the stereotypes about the Irish eating so many potatoes. But of course, when the potato blight happened in Ireland, like thousands and thousands of Irish people did die, because by that point in time, the potato was the staple of the Irish diet. But anyway, it's interesting to think about this, how foods that we think of as being staples were not always staples, and in fact, they kind of pass back and forth across different time periods. Okay. So enough on that tangent. Let's keep going. Okay. So Marx says the feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of the division of labor in each single workshop. So if you don't know anything about the kind of division of labor in the Middle Ages, you had these guilds, and a guild would be like a medieval labor union. And say you would have like the bakers guild, and the bakers, I guess it would be the bread bakers guild. And so you would have like a master bread baker, and they would take some apprentices, and these apprentices would work basically for free, but they would live with their master and learn the trade. And eventually they would pass these tests and be able to kind of go and open their own business. Now, the guild system kind of made it so that the goods that were produced were highly regulated. And so you knew if you bought a loaf of bread that it was going to be, so and so big, and that it was going to weigh this amount and probably taste like this. But obviously it stifled a lot of innovation. And then you would have, like, say, the cake bakers guild. And so if you baked bread, you couldn't bake cakes. And to us now in 2020, this seems like a really ludicrous idea. We think of people being able to do kind of whatever they want, but that was one of the trade-offs back in medieval society, that people who wanted to specialize and to be protected had to specialize very narrowly, and then other people had to be allowed to specialize in something different. Okay, so in place of that, you have the modern manufacturing system with the kind of division of labor that we're all familiar with, which is mainly the assembly line, where everybody does one specific task, and so that makes it so that you can produce things cheaply and quickly at a pace that's unthinkable in human history. So suddenly you can produce goods for much cheaper than you were ever able to produce them for, and more efficiently. But of course, the work is extremely boring. And I imagine some of you have probably worked in fast food, and so I'm sure you can give some examples here, talking about how it's not really that exciting when all you do is put vegetables on sandwiches. And it's not really that exciting when all you do is, flip meat on a grill or pull stuff out of a fryer, or take orders over the over the whatever the headset thing is, through the drive-through. Just doing the same thing over and over and over again is very boring, and Marx was keenly aware of this, and so he talked about this as the worker being alienated from their labor, because you never saw anything go from raw materials all the way to being a finished product. Okay, so I'm curious, since y'all are all at home now, and talking about these different things that you're doing to cope. Have any of you picked up cooking? I'm just curious. I'll keep an eye on the comments here. Or if you haven't picked up cooking, maybe you're cooking more, or trying to cook more at home, or help out with cooking. That's been something that I've been trying to do more. Yep. Okay. Yep. Look at all these people spilling in there. So everyone's trying to cook. Okay. So if you're trying to cook more, I think it's fair to say that when you take something and you a bunch of ingredients that are raw, and you make something from scratch, that it's so much better. It's even if it's hard and it's challenging and you struggle with it, you get to see something kind of transform from being raw ingredients or whatever, and it becomes something really special. So, like, for example, I make I call it a supreme pizza lasagna, and basically I make a homemade meat sauce, and I make the ricotta mixture. That's a separate thing into the cheese. Ramen can count if you add stuff to your ramen, though. If you're just doing the ramen in the water with the seasoning packet, I'm not convinced. Also, for that record, for that matter, cereal does not count. Even oatmeal, where you have to actually heat it up. So sorry, but we're looking for higher order cooking right now. Okay. So the other thing is with the supreme pizza lasagna is, I've got the vegetables that you would expect on a supreme pizza, your mushrooms and your onions and those things. And so I have a layer of the vegetables, I have a layer of the meat, I've got the meat sauce and the cheese. And so when the whole thing is done, the lasagna actually tastes like supreme pizza, but I make it with like the lentil pasta, which is healthy. And I use ground chicken and healthy ground beef in my meat sauce. And I use just plain tomato sauce, not marinara, and I add just a few things to it, mainly seasonings. And so I'm able to kind of count how the amount of calories in it and make it something healthy, even though it tastes really, really good. And so to take all of those ingredients and then to put them together to make something special is really one of the joys of cooking, which is how we get the awesome cookbook name. So what Marx is talking about when he says people are being alienated from their labor is he says that you don't get that joy at work anymore, and increasingly we don't get that joy at home. Think about it, like when you go to a restaurant and people cook for you and bring you food, it's one thing, and even if the food's really good, it's like, well, you didn't get to see it be made, you're not really sure what's in it. And for those of you who've worked in restaurants, a lot of times the things that get cooked are not made from scratch. They're just in bags and they're heated up. One student told me this really depressing story, how like everything at Chili's just comes out of like a bunch of different Ziplocs that they heat up. So again, there's nothing artistic about that. There's nothing especially exciting about that. And so for that reason, people who work in jobs like that don't get to feel that sense of joy and excitement at being a creator. You're alienated from your labor. So Marx sees that as kind of one of the hallmarks and problems of the shift to capitalism and to the mass production of goods in a single location. Okay, so let's keep going. Thanks for staying involved, and I appreciate y'all being here. Any questions so far? I'm gonna keep looking. Y'all type. Okay. Okay. So Marx talks about how the bourgeoisie rose to kind of political power, and how it took a long time for it to kind of incubate and become the revolutionary class that it became that led to the rise of capitalism. But he says the bourgeoisie, wherever it got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, he puts it in quotes, natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless biscuit, indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Okay, hold on. Gotta get biscuit. Come on. Okay. All right. You gonna behave? Okay. All right. So for Marx, the religion and the law are not objective realities. They're not things that inform the way we should live our lives. They are kind of smoke and mirrors that hide the exploitation of the bourgeoisie class. Okay, so there at one point Marx calls he calls religion the opiate of the masses, and that quote's often taken out of context. He doesn't actually mean that religion. He's not comparing it just to opiates, but how life is so painful and involves so much suffering that for the poor, for the proletariat, that religion is one of the only things that makes life bearable. So in some ways, it's kind of an endorsement of religion, but at the same time, it's also a criticism. So Marx he suggests here and elsewhere that behind the law, behind religion, is always this sense of wanting to oppress the other classes. And he sees the shift to communism and to his belief system as the only way to get out of that. And so that's an important distinction in Marx. Okay. Let me see. All right. Marx says the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeoisie epoch from all earlier ones. Okay, so what's he saying, or what he is saying, right, is that previously the idea of the revolutionary classes was always stability. It was this idea of guilds, for example, that you would have masters who would then take apprentices, and then the apprentices would learn the trade, and then they would go on to become masters, and they would limit the number of people who could become masters and apprentices in any trade. And this would kind of restrict the flow of information. Yes, it meant that people could, the goods could be kind of restricted and regulated, but at the same time, it also meant that the flow of information and the ability to make goods widely available was not a high priority in most of these societies. Biscuit, stop. Okay. Okay. So, what else do I want to say about this? Okay. But in contrast, he says the bourgeoisie, they always have to innovate, because the goal is always to find a way to lower the cost of production and to make the goods more widely available and to find new markets. So the problem becomes that no matter how cheap a good is, there's always a way to try to make it cheaper. And so for now, let me give you the example that I think you're probably most familiar with, and that has to do with, again, food. And so, there's all these different fad diets right now. Keto is really big. And Atkins, which is another high fat diet where you eat low carbs. And so you're seeing like this explosion of new snack foods that are all based on having these really high caloric counts and really high fat counts, but really low carb counts. And so these companies are like producing, like, they're called like fat bombs. It's like a bunch of peanut butter dipped in like dark chocolate. And the sweetener is monk fruit sweetener or sugar alcohol or something like that, something that keeps the carb count low. Okay, so the first of those things to come out are really, really expensive. And as more and more companies kind of enter that market, you get better and better versions of the product, and the price of them goes down. And the example that I can give you that's not so niche is potato chips or tortilla chips or cereal or ramen noodles. Or frozen food, like all of those things that are really widely available and people buy a lot of. They're even if there's only a couple of companies, but there's a lot. They produce tons of different things. Think of how many different varieties of chips are manufactured by Lay's. I mean, it's almost unthinkable. So, and then you can go to a place like Costco or Sam's or whatever and get a massive bag, like 3 times the size of what you find at H-E-B, and it costs 20% more than a regular size bag, which the math doesn't add up on it. How are they able to do that? Well, they buy it in bulk. Okay, so Marx is really insightful on that account, that capitalism requires this kind of constant innovation, constant searching, and constant push to drive the market ever further. Okay, let me keep going. All right. So then Marx goes on to say, all fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices, but he means prejudgments, and opinions are swept away. All newly formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Okay. So I think it's kind of interesting, since he's so interested in material things. The idea that he's interested in relations is kind of problematic in Marxist language, because obviously the relations between people are not merely material. How you feel about someone, if you admire them, if you like them, all that kind of stuff. Those are more complicated emotions that can't be boiled down to something as simple as like mathematical calculus. Still, I think it's pretty easy to see that Marx's emphasis on how things become antiquated really, really quickly, and ideas that we thought of as being new and exciting just a little while ago quickly become disrupted and disappear. And so, the example I can think of in our class is how you're always teaching me y'all's cool lingo, and how that lingo, is different from the class before you. And I'll use things that people taught me last spring or this past fall in your class, and y'all will all look at me like I'm a lunatic, and like I'm just not cool. And which I'm not saying that I am, but the point is that that something like language is so dynamic and changes constantly. Think of what you think of as being like a really good TV show. I mean, you might really like something right now, and 3 months from now, you might think it's a terrible TV show. How many things do you really enjoy so much that you want to go rewatch them? I think The Office is kind of interesting because it's one of those shows where people, they enjoy it so much they want to rewatch it over and over and over again. Now, see, I'm kind of a goofball. I really like to rewatch shows. It's like one of my favorite pastimes, especially like comedies and stuff like that. But I know I'm an anomaly in that way. So the point being that because of this constant revolution, or not evolution, because this constant evolution rather, and goods always being changed, and the relations of production always being changed, the relationships between people in society are always changing. So that means things like language are constantly under construction. Things are always being changed, and this is complicated. It makes society really dynamic and kind of unstable as well. And so this is going to get picked up by the postmodernists in the 20th century, and they're going to talk about what they call liquid modernity, Zygmunt Bauman coins that term, talking about how, again, like what Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. Everything, our social relations, our ideas, our values, all of those things that bind people together, those things kind of lose their power over our mind and over our behavior, and eventually they just kind of disappear. So, yeah. All right. There's just a couple other things I want to talk about. Okay. All right. I mean, he just goes on and on and on to talk about like all the horrible things that the bourgeoisie have done. They create these massive cities, and they force people from their country forms of life. They make everyone follow their values because their values are the things that are seen as respectable, and their values are the things that pay well, and also the goods that are produced. And so this is part of the critique of the bourgeois class. Okay. Okay. And like I said, I mean, the main gist of this, where he's going with this, is how the way that the bourgeoisie were able to outmaneuver people in the feudal period was they were able to produce goods at a massive scale and to kind of centralize labor and make it so that goods could be produced at a fraction of the cost that they were produced before, which meant that things that were not available for people from the lower classes especially were suddenly made widely available. And so this kind of destabilizes society, makes it so that people are able to enjoy a standard of living that was previously unimaginable. And but at the same time, it also creates these constant new wants, new desires, and flux in society. And eventually this leads to members of the bourgeois class being pushed into the proletariat. And so again, the proletariat gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the bourgeoisie gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so eventually the proletariat will realize their shared struggle against the bourgeoisie, and they'll rise up and kill them all. And Marx was very explicit about this. He talks about it at the end of the Communist Manifesto, how perhaps you think that the need for violent revolution is an overstatement. Perhaps basically you think I'm joking, and he says over and over and over again. He talks about all of the different alternatives to this, but he's very explicit. He says that there's it's the only way forward, is that the only way that you're ever going to get rid of this previous oppressor class is to eliminate them, and that the most effective means of doing this is by violence. And so it's not surprising that Marx was a big admirer of the French Revolution, where they did what exactly? Well, they killed off the entire aristocracy, and you had what's it called? The Terror, I think. I'll have to double check. Basically, where for 100 years, they killed off aristocrats, and then the aristocrats, the new class became aristocrats, and then they got killed off too. Just a humongous amount of bloodshed. And Marx justified this on the grounds that the only way you can get rid of the oppressive class is to kill them all. So when people say that Marxism is an ideology or a system of political ideas, and that it's written in blood, that's what they're referring to, is that passage in Marx and Engels' book, The Communist Manifesto. And if you haven't read the whole book, you should read it. I think everyone should have to read it so they can see for themselves. You always hear me say in class, I think you should be required to read the important books in all these different traditions, and you should read them for yourselves so you know what they actually say. Then you don't have to take people's word for it. So even though I've done the work to sit there and try to figure these things out for you and explain them to you, I want you to go read them for yourselves. And then let's say you have a different interpretation than I do. I'd be happy to hear about that, and I'd like to talk about that. So again, read it for yourself. I'm not afraid of coming to a different conclusion than you, and I value y'all's effort in the class, and so I want to be able to have a discussion. And I think one of the best ways to have a good discussion is for us all to spend time trying to educate ourselves, and the best way to do that is to read and to think. Okay, let's see. Okay, the very last part of this is basically Marx's idea of how the capitalists invest in machinery, and that machinery makes it possible to produce goods at a rate and in a volume that's basically unthinkable. But it basically means that laborers are deprived of their dignity, and that they become appendages in the or cogs basically in the machine that is a particular factory. And so their work has no dignity. They become alienated from their labor. They're bored. It's important to note that, like, during the time that Marx is writing, I mean, it's not uncommon for people to work 7 days a week at a factory, and for them to be there, somewhere between 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And this was really common. And it was extremely common for there to be this kind of massive, what's the best way to explain this? Massive overwork. I mean, people working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and there were no limits on the amount of time that people could be forced to work. And so that's where we have these kind of 40-day work week laws and stuff like that. They arise much later in history. But you have the very beginning of them kind of right after Marx's writing, where people are talking about how you shouldn't be able to employ children, even though child labor was extremely common for most of human history. You need to provide safer working conditions for people, because people were frequently injured at work. You can imagine, with all the machines around, that people were torn into all sorts of horrible pieces. And then on top of that, they were drinking. There weren't rules about sobriety and things like that. So you have someone who stayed out all night, got drunk. They're forced to come into work, say at 7 a.m. or whatever, and they're not feeling very well, obviously, and they get their arm cut off or something like that. I mean, it's just a really horrible kind of situation. John said the problem with that is another class just takes their place. Yeah, that's that is the problem, isn't it? That when your justification is that whatever class is there, whatever, and again, people can define oppression in different ways. Whatever oppressive class is there, that the only way to get rid of them is killing them off. Well, then what happens? Does that leave a vacuum in society for a little bit? But eventually that vacuum gets filled. And then what happens? So then you have a new upper class, or whatever you want to call it. And then does the pattern repeat itself? Do you then have the same leverage to kill them off too? Or is that the state, the good state, for Marx, and the state, the socialist state, where people need to kind of fall in line and adopt the socialist ideas? It's complicated, and for Marx, history is only going in one direction, and everything is kind of on the up and up. And sees a primitive communism he thinks is actually pretty good, and then it gets worse with feudalism and capitalism, and then socialism, and then communism, and everything's kind of rising like that. So he thinks that history is inevitably going in that direction. It's going to happen. And so his argument is that this is a scientific explanation of how society works. So there's that. Let me double check this. I think there's one other thing I want to talk about, and then I'll be done. Okay. So here's something interesting. It says, the less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age of sex. So Marx is talking about how when you can create a machine that helps you do the work, then it becomes less important that you be skilled. It becomes less important that you be strong. And so then it becomes becomes possible to hire anyone to do that work. And so this is how these factories are able to have so many child labor workers, because if the work is low skilled and you don't have to be strong to do it, and you don't have to be tall to do it, and you don't have to be particularly physically developed to do it, then it's really easy to hire children, because obviously it's easier to hire children for less money than it is to hire adults, because there's kind of this idea that adults are responsible for taking care of the family, even though, again, with child labor, it was common for kids to work and then for them to pitch their earnings into the family funds. They were able to survive. So I think that's the gist of the Marx stuff I wanted to cover. I know it's a lot. This video is already at 55 minutes. I'm sorry that it's so long. We'll see if I can find a way to kind of condense these things, and also to share my screen so I can show you the text itself. But anyway, any questions for me? I'll sit here for a second and let y'all think. If I understand this correctly, when I end this stream, this video will stay up on the channel. So if there's something you're unclear about, you're able to go back and watch it. And I will keep an eye on the comments going forward, because not everyone is here. We have 21 people here, which is excellent, but not everyone's here. Can you see the dog? He has a name, right? His name is Biscuit. Biscuit, come here. Come here. Come here. Okay. It's going to make me go get him. Hold on. Come here. Come here. Okay. Whoops. Okay. Here's Biscuit. Yeah. He's a good boy. Yes. He's very sulky. He's been wanting to play ball. Oh, thank you, Janelle. I appreciate that. Okay, so this is Biscuit. So he's learned some new tricks. It'd be too hard, I think, to show you this way, but I'll post a video at some point showing you his awesome new tricks. So what he does, in case you're curious, right, is we do a high five, and then we do an on the side, and then we do an in the hole, and he puts his nose in there. So anyway, he's very smart, and yeah, he's a really good dog. And I don't know if we ever talked about this in class, but we actually had a weenie dog when I was growing up, and so his name was Reese, and he was red. So I didn't even know they had these blonde dachshunds, but my wife found out about it, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, imagine if we got one." So anyway, he's how old are you? 5.5? Yeah, no, 5.333 repeating years old. So I don't know. Thank you, Kat. So that's Biscuit, and I'm John. So I hope things are going well for all of you, and we'll keep this going for now so that we can continue to interact, and hopefully you all are having a good time. And we'll use the first couple minutes of every lecture to kind of talk and check in and see what's going on. And hopefully whatever cool stuff y'all are into, y'all share with me. And I'll kind of keep y'all up to date on what's going on in my life as well. So again, I want to point this out, since we just finished talking about Marx and he talks a lot about politics. This book is by a political philosopher named Alan Ryan. It's called On Aristotle. And it's all about Aristotle's view on politics. And his writings on it. I'm about a third of the way through. Super easy to read, really, really fair. It does a great job of explaining things. And then obviously, once you read something like this, it's a lot easier to go and pick up the Aristotle for yourself, and then see what he had to say. Because, like I said already, I think it's important for all of us to read and engage with the text and see what it actually says. So there we go. I think that's all I want to say. And we'll pick this up Wednesday again, barring some kind of email from y'all saying a different time would work better, we're going to keep it just like it was in class, right? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it will always be at noon so that it's hopefully accessible for all of you. If there's a problem, if you're having an issue turning in work on time, if you're having a problem with something that I said or you're confused or whatever, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to, obviously I'd love to talk and check in and see what's going on with you and to be helpful. So I know this is a really crazy time. I'm stressed. I'm having a hard time. I know a lot of y'all are as well. And so just let me know what's going on with you. And if you need some help or whatever, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to do what I can. All right, so I'm gonna stop it there, and I'll see you all on Wednesday with Durkheim. Okay.